Hello, welcome. Today we're looking at still life. It's worth stopping to think about what we actually mean and understand by the term still life, and why the items in front of me would qualify as being part of a still life. The fact is that these are all inanimate objects. What I want you to do as an initial exercise is to take those two words, still and life, and brainstorm each of them. See what comes to mind when you think of those words, and see what you notice. So here are just a few of the terms that I came up with brainstorming these two concepts. And you can see that we've got very opposing lists. So what does this tell us about still life? So as you approach the upcoming activities for this project, I want you to bear these lists in mind. Think about which of them you're expressing, perhaps more, perhaps less. Now let's briefly consider the history of still life in art. Let's look at examples of still life paintings from different centuries. I want you to think about how they differ in style, content, lighting, colour, atmosphere, level of detail. What do you think the artist was interested in? For example, the intricate detail of a vase, the texture of flower petals, the light quality of lustrous fabric drapes, or the symbolism of various elements. Which still lifes do you find surprising? Which ones leap out at you for being different? What overall feeling do they evoke? For example, calm, homely, warm, quirky, macabre, random, and so on. Which ones would you hang on your own wall, and why? Now I want you to set up a still life of your own and think carefully about what elements to include. You might want to focus on more traditional still life subject matter like fruit, flowers, jugs and so on. Or you might choose to rummage around your home and find all sorts of interesting objects that will make for a slightly more unusual still life setup. Have a look around your home, your garden or school classroom, and look out for items that really catch your eye as being interesting for whatever reason. I would suggest assembling all of your items very roughly on a worktop somewhere, and then you can begin to group them together into something that makes sense, possibly because of a theme. Or of course, you might choose to mix up your subject matter and go for something quite random. So we've got some obvious still life ingredients, traditional fruits and vessels. We've also got some slightly more unusual things here. Tools quite often make really interesting still life setups. You might also think of things like musical instruments, gardening equipment, shoes. Think about how many items you want. It could be as few as 2 or 3. It's quite useful to stick with a manageable number of items in your still life. You might also think about the space in which you're setting your still life up. You might think about the lighting. Do you have additional light sources that would enhance your still life and create interesting shadows? What's the background like? If you can find an item that's suitably strong and stable, then why not add a bit of height into your composition, possibly with some kind of a drape to obscure the actual item. And then we can begin to arrange our items at different heights. Think about the composition. Think about negative space. Maybe include something highly reflective so you can see other things around it reflected in it. Think about your lighting and your shadows. Maybe think about unexpected juxtapositions. Think about viewing the same still life from different angles. Think particularly about your range of different shapes in the composition. So you've got strong verticals, you've got horizontals, diagonals, round curves, and angular shapes. Think about how you might create an interesting focal point. By all means, spend some time getting your composition exactly right, but don't spend too long on it. We want to move on now, do some sketching, painting, begin to record our still life. Before you start, think about which way up you want your paper. Think about roughly how much of that paper you're going to fill. And even before I actually touch the paper with my pen or pencil, I'm going to just very loosely indicate to myself where each item's going, how much space it will fill. This should give me an idea of how much of this space I'm going to fill. Notice how I'm holding this pencil. I'm not clenching it and going to make a very hard, firm mark. I'm holding it very loosely towards the end of it, and that gives me a lot less pressure. So I'm kind of almost tickling the paper. The less you commit at this stage, the more you're able to amend things if you're not happy with them later on. So don't press too hard at this stage is what I'm saying. What interests me about these antlers in particular is the angles of the different prongs of the horns and that sort of thing. So that's something that I'm going to look at specifically, the way that each angle relates to every other angle. This is where we begin to think about the negative space. Also, what I can see from where I'm standing is the shadows. Don't worry about these being too precise. What's particularly important is that you're recording your still life in a form that shows that you've observed it closely, that shows that shows evidence of observational study. If you've got items that are vessels, quite often you'll notice that you've got elliptical forms. Really look at the shapes of those. I'm still being very loose with the pencil, not holding it firmly, just enough to steady it on the paper. If you've got any kind of vessel, jug, or anything like that, you'll have these elliptical forms. So they're not circles because we're not looking at them directly from above. They're going to be oval forms. So it's really worth looking at those relative to the rest of the shape of the item, of the object. As you become more confident, you can use a bit more pressure with the pencil or the pen. Begin to be just that bit firmer with your mark making. This is a very rough indication of where everything's going. This is just to begin to loosen up. I've moved things around a little bit, and I'm going to use a pen this time. As before, I can loosely indicate, just for my own benefit, where I'm going on the page, just sort of roughly to work out how much of that I'm going to fill. Notice I've got it this way up this time because it naturally works with that sort of very tall, thin composition. But always think about which way up you want your page. Oop, pen's not working. Even with a pen, especially with a biro like this one, you can use it very, very lightly to begin with. Very much like I was using the pencil earlier. Effectively just sort of tickling the page. Get a very light ink. Notice that little bit of a negative shape just there, for example. That's the sort of thing we might begin to think later on what we might do with that in terms of colour, in terms of texture. More of these ellipses. As I'm going, I'm beginning to strengthen, reinforce those lines that I made to begin with. But what I'm not going to do is get bogged down in too much of this detail before I've got the whole thing roughly mapped out. Look at relative sizes of the objects in your composition. This is what makes the whole thing interesting to look at. So it's worth, you know, observing those, noticing them. I'm looking at where this vessel starts relative to this one, so I can more or less take a line down from there, and that gives me the sort of starting point for this handle, and from there I'm going to fill in where I'm going with this little jug. The point of these initial sketches is for us to loosen up, to avoid becoming too pedantic with detail. Shadows obviously echo the item that they represent, but they also reflect the shape of what they're falling across. So it's really worth thinking about how that is going to convey more of the rest of your composition. I could at this point obviously go on and on for a few more minutes or an hour or more, just painstakingly putting all of the detail in. But I'm not going to do that at this stage. I want to treat these as loosening up exercises. The colour of our substrate, by substrate I mean what we're painting onto, the colour of our substrate can actually influence our colour palette and the overall colour scheme of our finished picture. You might choose to work on something quite unexpected and bright, or something very subtle. If I look at this still life setup in front of me, I notice that the overall dominant tone is quite dark. And then we've got these very light tones of objects that sort of come into the foreground for that reason, because of that contrast with the background and because of the strong lighting on them. Let's actually try setting a timer for this one. So I'm going to set this for, let's say, 5 minutes. I've chosen a darkish colour to work on, and I'm going to work with coloured pencil this time. Start by choosing a few colours that are actually going to show up. Right, let's, if I can remember how to use this. There we go. Right. So now we've got the timer just to keep us focused. And you don't want to be in a rush doing this, but it's just a sort of, it's not working against the clock idea. It's just the idea of focus, keeping yourself focused, and not getting bogged down in detail too soon. So it's a really useful discipline. Because we're working on a relatively dark background, we can now come forward out of that background, come into the light, so to speak. So where we see light contours here, we can use something like this very light grey colour to lift it out of the background. We can, of course, also go a little bit darker than the actual substrate, which we could do in a minute. I'm still being very loose with the coloured pencils. This is still just to give myself an idea of where I might want to go with a more developed sketch later on, or painting. None of these sketches needs to look particularly finished. In fact, much better if it doesn't. As Leonardo da Vinci said, art is never finished, it is only abandoned. This is just beginning to give us some of the idea of tonal values, so we can begin to lift that, the lighter contours out of the darker background. If we had more time later on, we can begin to go darker than the background, than the substrate, and really bring out those contrasts. But this is just another observational compositional study. And our alarm is about to go off. There we go. There, that'll do for now. Just as another example of a sketch that shows your compositional awareness. The more of these still life studies you do, the more you're likely to sort of want to home in on certain things. And that might be particular subject matter. For me, I'm fascinated by this pair of antlers, the way they interlock, the way they work together, the negative space between them. It might be other things that you choose to focus on, the colours, the texture, the form, shape. There are no right or wrong answers in that regard, and what you choose to focus on may be entirely different from what other students focus on, so don't be put off by that. Now I'm going to set this for 10 minutes. I've chosen another sort of mid-tone paper to work on. I've also changed my still life setup around again. It just keeps it fresh if you want to do that, or of course you can keep the same setup, though I would still recommend, even if you have exactly the same still life for every picture you do, I would move around it, get it from different angles. Hopefully by this stage you should feel quite loose in your whole sort of approach to doing this. You've done quite a few of these observational studies, very loose, very simple sketches. By now we should be feeling quite loosened up. This is where I'm beginning to look at the lightest tones using, this is Chinese white, to really bring that forward out of that background. And having a few minutes extra means that you can do that. But as I've said, it's never a rush against the clock, any of this. Your intended result shouldn't be something that looks finished. It's much more a case of showing your creative process, your work process, your thought process. The key word being process rather than a finished piece. I'm just beginning to introduce a little bit of colour here. We could go with colours that we actually see in the piece, in the still life, or you could go for something that you don't see in the still life, but which feels right in terms of the tonal value. To me, it's far more interesting when you begin to look at colours in a much more expressive way, so we can work with colours that we love, colours that work perhaps with the background. This is where we begin to think about slightly more developed studies. Obviously the dark blue is tonally darker than the actual substrate, whereas something like this allows us to go much lighter. And the white is obviously going to allow us to have the strongest, oops, the strongest highlights. About to run out of time again, but that's fine. Notice this is totally unfinished, but it shows evidence of development of our still life concept. I'm going to suggest at this stage that you set up an easel if you have access to one. If you don't have a freestanding easel, you might possibly have a tabletop one that you've got space for alongside your still life setup. Easels do have a bit of a life of their own. It's really important to make sure that it's not going to collapse. Always make sure that you've got space to step back into from your easel. One of the most important reasons we might use an easel is so that our canvas, whatever we use as a canvas, is flat relative to us. And it means that I can step back from this and it's still flat relative to me, as opposed to being flat on a tabletop where if I step back from it, it's going to distort purely due to perspective. What I'm going to do is place a board on here, which is quite sturdy. I've found a piece of paper that I'm going to work on, and I'm going to, very roughly speaking, attach that to there so that it gives me a nice firm substrate to work on. For this piece I'm going to use acrylics, hence I'm wearing an apron to protect my clothes. I keep my acrylic paints between painting sessions in an airtight container, which allows me to carry on using them. I'm going to set this timer now for, let's say, 45 minutes. It's not that you're working against the clock, it's more that you're setting yourself a focus. Try and get your canvas as close as you can to your still life setup. I'm going to start with plenty of water and tiniest bits of the paint. So there's not really a lot of paint on there. In fact, if you want to start with just water, then you can do that as well. And I'm working on black paper, so that's going to sort of show up quite well the more paint I put on there. But at this stage I don't want it to be too committal, just like we started off with very little pressure. In this case we're starting off with very little paint. I'm working just on black paper. If you have something more sturdy than that, then do make use of that. You can almost use just the water to sketch your design out, your composition out. And if it goes wrong, so to speak, then you can just let it dry. tend to mix the colours up on the brush rather than on the palette. So you've got several colours on that brush at the same time, and they all come out, they all manifest on the canvas. I'm not too worried about runs particularly, they kind of add to the effect. Again, I'm going to introduce a bit more expressive colour into this, as that's something that interests me, but it might be something else that interests you. It might be the texture, might be reflective qualities, it might be negative space. There, I think I'm going to leave this one at that. I think that's sort of as much as I want to say with that particular study. I would rather move on and do one more study. For my last demo, I found quite a bright colour of substrate to work on, to bright orange, which sort of suggests to me a bold graphic sort of style of working. So I'm going to use these, which are Posca pens. Posca pens are acrylic paint, but in a marker pen form, so they're extremely versatile as an art medium in their own right. It's quite useful to have a bit of scrap cardboard here, just for testing these pens and getting a feel for what they do. You can see there's different sizes of nib, which gives you a wide range of different mark making ability. Again, I've changed the still life around very slightly, give a bit of variety. I think in this case I'm just going to press start rather than count down, just for interest's sake. So I'll put that so you can maybe see it. Right, off we go. Now I'm going to start with this big chunky marker. Let's just actually... So as I said, this bold orange colour kind of suggests a bold sort of punchy style, and I feel like actually turning this around slightly. Let's go for that. Again, just sort of marking this out in my head more than anything else. Now I'm going to use this thin side of the nib to give me a thin straight line, looking at one angle relative to another as we've done throughout. It obviously takes some confidence working straight on with an indelible marker pen like this, but hopefully by this stage you should have sort of loosened up enough to be able to launch straight in without worrying too much. Now with Poscas you can smudge them quite nicely, very much like you can with actual acrylic paints. And you'll notice there that I can go over the black with the white. Might still be a little bit wet, hence they're slightly merging, but generally speaking you can go over a darker colour with a lighter colour. That's what I was looking for. By the end of this module, you should end up with a series of still life studies based on observation, including simple sketches, more developed drawings or paintings, optional studies of small details, at least one full still life study, and evidence of development or at least consideration of stylization. In the next module, we're going to explore still life further by setting ourselves some fun additional challenges, but it's really important to base these on a solid foundation of observational studies. Really hope you've enjoyed this module so far, and I'll see you in the next.